Okay, we're going to do the last pieces that get applied to the garment, and that is the collar and the collar stand. And what I'm going to do is talk you through this, but at some point I'm going to stop and explain to you what a collar stand exactly is. So we're using piece 21 and 20. I have them upside down here, I apologize. You want to, once again, to make sure that you've basted your, take this off, that you've basted your non-fusible interfacing to the wrong side of the collar. Okay, and you want to do the same thing with your collar band. I'm sorry, your collar stand. You're going to baste right to the edge, and then we're going to trim back just the way we have been doing. So let's start with the collar first. And what you want to make sure, again, taking a look at your pattern for markings, you're going to notch your 2 notches on one side and 2 notches on the other. Those are going to match up to your collar stand. And also you want to tailor tack on your 2 ends within the circle of your size on the 2 ends. Run yourself a tailor tack. That also is going to match up to your collar stand. Okay? So I'm basted on, I'm notched, I have my tailor tacks, and I'm ready to sew. So I'm going to prepare my collar first because my collar is going to get set into my band. So the notched side is the side that's going into the band. So you're sewing the outer side, which is the bigger part of the arc. So I'm going to do 5/8. And I just want to zoom in here and talk about this process for a second. So typically, if I know I'm going to top stitch, then what I do is I sew off to the ends. So I sew 5/8 and then clip my threads. I don't back tack. Then I put it into the machine and sew 5/8 all the way to the other end, sew off the end, clip the threads, and then come back in and sew here. Because I know that I'm going to be top stitching. The place where it gets tricky is trimming back the interfacing, but you can work around that. So what I'm going to do now is to do what I've been doing all along, and that is to trim back my interfacing right to my stitching. When I get to where I crossed, I'm going to just cut it off because that's going to get clipped. And then I'm going to do the same thing here. Take this off here. To get in here and trim back my interfacing right to my stitching. I lost my tailor tack. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, trim this back all the way around my piece. Once I have my interfacing trimmed back pretty closely to the stitching line, then I'm going to go ahead and trim the seam allowance. So on the corner of the collar, I'm going to cut that corner off. And then what I'm going to do is trim back my seam allowance again in half. So that's going to be a little longer than a little longer than where you trimmed. So the seam allowance that's left is a little longer than where you trimmed for your interfacing. Okay, go ahead and do that all the way around. Going to get to this corner. And same thing, I'm going to cut off this corner about a little less than 1/4 of an inch from where it crosses. So sometimes when you sew a collar, or another method of doing it is to sew and turn the corner. So you would stitch to right here where the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance from this seam and this seam match. Leave your needle in and turn the work so that you're not creating this corner. But again, if I know I'm top stitching, I feel like for me I get a better corner if I do it this way. A little bit of a sharper corner, because there's some stitching there to hold back the rest of the seam allowance. So now what I'm going to do is to take my little embroidery scissor. I really recommend that you get one of these, and I'm just going to cut out any of the interfacing that's left in here. And this is a little hard to do with the camera angle. Then the other thing I do is I snip in about half so that when this fabric goes in to the corner, it'll fold over each other. Okay, once I've done that, I can now take my collar, turn it right side out, take my point turner, and get it in there and work my point out. I usually get a really good sharp corner with this method. Not quite there. That's again the point turners. It's really worth the investment. So the next time you're either in the store or if you want to order one online, I really recommend them because they work great. So if I look here, got a little bit of a pile in there, not too much. I might do a better job trimming at the other end. And again, I want to be careful, but at the same time I know I'm going to top stitch, so I'm going to catch anything that gets too close. Okay, so I've got a pretty good corner going there. And now I'm going to come down and do this side. Do the same thing on this side. So I'm trimming it back, getting rid of the extra, any of the extra interfacing that's left behind. I'm going to give this a little snip. So let's see if I can take a little bit more off here. So you want to make sure that you leave some, you don't want to lose it. And then I'm going to turn this inside out. And use my point turner to help me get it exactly. Oh, this one came out a little better. That always usually happens too. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to press this before I top stitch it. That'll be my next sewing step, but before I do that, I'm going to go in and like we did back in week 1, we're going to press this seam open. And then once we press that open, and again, you can get in as far as you can with your iron. And then once I press that seam open, then I'm going to fold the shirt in half and press it down. So I've pressed my seam open. Now I'm going to take my shirt and make sure that I have it exactly on the seam line. You can also go ahead if you wanted to, it makes it a nice press, is to get in here and to press this seam open as well, the side seam, if you want to call it that. Same thing over here. You just want to make sure that when you fold it, it's exact. Let's see, it's small at this point. So, okay. Yeah, So now everything's pressed, and it's almost going to want to fold on its own, which is always nice. And now, make sure I have everything lined up and my points look the same, which they do. And now I'm going to go ahead and press it closed. Yeah, pressing those sides, those little side seams open is a good idea, because then you know what you've got, you know what you're working with here. Okay. So now I want to continue to press, making sure that it's right, and now I'm going to continue by stitching. So now the next step, once I've got my collar all constructed, is I'm going to go in and I'm going to top stitch. And as I said to you in the previous video, I think I'm going to do edge and foot on this, so both edge and foot. Make sure that your interfacing side is the top of the collar. Okay, so that's going to be, you really do have the choice either way, but you want the interfacing to be on the top. So give yourself a good press. And then, actually one more step that I neglected. Once you've got it really where you want to have it, then what you're going to do is to take all your layers and just baste them together, just so they don't shift while you go in to do your decorative stitching. So this next little step will be your decorative stitching. So I'm going to baste these edges, these raw edges together. This is the edge that's going to go into the collar stand, and then the collar stand is the part that attaches to the shirt. So once you have all your layers together and really well pressed, this should go very, very quickly. Baste that seam together. Again, you can take not too big of stitches. Some of you I noticed are taking giant. They shouldn't be that big, but they don't have to be small either. Okay, so now it looks good. My corners look the same. I'm neatly pressed, so now I can go in and top stitch. Now that I have my collar prepped, I'm going to, and ready to go, really ready to set in, I'm going to focus on the band. So what you want to do, again, is to make sure that you snip your notches. So you have 2 notches here that are going to line up with that collar. And then you want to tailor tack here. It's going to show you where to stop stitching. And then along here, this is the bottom of this is the part that will get attached to the body. This is where these notches are really important. So these are going to get attached to the body. So you're going to put one here. I'm going to have you put a notch at center back so that you can line up that notch when you're attaching it to the body. And your other notch on your other side. Okay. And again, we're not paying attention to the buttonholes or the buttons on this, so we're good. So your interfacing is basted onto your piece. And now what you're going to do is you're going to take the wrong side of the uninterfaced piece and you're going to turn it up 5/8 of an inch and you're going to press it. And again, remember we did this for the band and for the cuff. So we're going to press this very carefully. So measure 5/8 pin, measure 5/8 pin all the way down, and then give it a good press. Now I'm going to take my collar band, hold it where the arches are up. I'm going to take the band that the interfacing is stitched onto. I'm going to take my collar, holding it so that the wider edge is facing the wider edge of the arc here. So where I've hand basted it together, that's going to match up to the top of the collar stand. And then I'm going to pin it. And this is where your notches come in. Very handy. So I'm going to match up my notches here. Going to match up my notches here on the other side. And then I'm going to notice, make sure that my collar, and again your collar is going to have a little bit of a curve to it, so you can make sure that you follow that curve because you want that little bit of a curve. So now I'm going to make sure that the end of my collar comes to where my tailor tack is. I'm going to pin it. You don't want to put too many pins on this because you'll see in a second what's going to happen. And then the same thing over here. Going to pin it. And this looks, so see, it's telling me I might have to shift my collar down a little bit. So let me go back and repin it. Okay, so what happened for me was that I started with the notches and I lined it up. I think what I'm going to ask you to do is to start with your tailor tacks. Line up your collar with the tailor tack. So the tailor tack on your collar should still be in there. So I'm going to line that up with the tailor tack of the shirt and then come down and do the other side. And then go in and do the notches. And you're going to see you have a little bit of a bubble here, and that's really where your ease is for that collar to come around the curve, which you'll see in a second. So now I pin the right side of my collar to the right side of my band, and now I'm going to take the band that I've pressed under. So I've pressed under to the wrong side. I've pressed my seam allowance, and now I'm going to pin it. So I'm sandwiching the collar in between the two bands, and that's really what's going to catch it. And then the collar is going to get attached, the collar and the band are going to get attached to the shirt from this band side. Okay, so I've taken my one band with the interfacing, my collar all nice and top stitched, and I'm sandwiching it in between those two. This is the band where I've pressed up the seam allowance, and this is the band with the interfacing. Okay, and now I'm going to stitch, and I'm going to stitch again 5/8 here from here. Again, let me zoom in. So I'm going to start 5/8 here. I've got a little tailor tack there to tell me I'm right on. I'm going to back tack. I'm going to sew 5/8 of an inch all along the top of the collar. It's actually the top of the band. And again, it's sandwiched in between. Okay, so I've stitched around my 5/8. Be very careful going around your corner, go slowly, and that's again where the stitching guide really helps quite a bit. So we're going to do the same thing. We need to trim back, but before we do that, what I want you to do is to go inside your collar band, I should say, and I want you to trim back your collar first. Okay, so let's get rid of some of that bulkiness, although I see a lot of you have been using the featherweight, so you may bump into some problems when it comes time for the buttonholes, but we'll figure that out together. Interfacing, interfacing is another part of stitching that's very important, that almost every garment has some, unless it's a sweater knit obviously, but almost every stitch cut and sew garment has interfacing in it because it acts as a support almost all buttonholes, and I'm going to talk a lot next week about buttonholes and postage stamps, and so giving you some advice on how to do it, how to put buttonholes and shears. And so right now what I'm doing is cutting back my seam allowance so that it's not so bulky in there. Okay, and then once I've cut back my actual collar piece, now what I'm going to do is to go in and trim back as we've been doing all along. And just show you this a little bit because you know what the drill is now. We're gonna score back that interfacing right back to the stitching. A little trouble on the curve here. Okay, so I'm going to do that all around, and then I'll go through and trim back my seam allowance. And as always, you're always going to snip. When you snip on a curve, you take a little, like a pizza pie slice out, like so. That's going to take that fabric out. So when you're going concave, you just snip in. Sometimes people will do this for both, but you won't do this in the industry. They don't do this. This is purely a sewing tech, a hand sewing tech, a couture technique, let's call it. Yeah, and then this part will be, you can go ahead and trim. Okay? But I want you to want to make sure that you trim back the collar a little further than you take the rest of the seam allowance on here. So trim this back, trim the interfacing on the collar stand back right to the stitching, and then take your seam allowance back. You can either just snip it in or you can take your little slices out there. Okay? Then I'll show you how to turn it. Okay, so I've stitched around, I've trimmed and clipped, and I think I'm ready to go. So now what you're going to do is to take your curve and turn it to the outside and roll out your curve. So you have that nice rounded shirt closure for the front. Okay, and there you go. So now I'm going to give this a really good press. And you can see here, this is the part that's turned under. So this is the part that's going to get attached to the shirt. So it's the side with the interfacing. I think I need to trim that back a little bit. So again, checking everything as you go along. I'm going to give this a really nice, good, firm press on both sides. Making sure that it's nice and rounded and even on both sides. And then I'm ready to attach to the shirt. So you see you've sandwiched your collar in between your two collar bands. Okay? Make sure when you press, with a little tip, that you press both sides. So that's my wrong side. That's the side that's going to go. But I also want to turn it over and make sure that my band is all nice and flat on this side as well. So make sure that you press both sides of your collar band application. Okay? The next thing you're going to do is to take your shirt and at 1/2 inch, because remember you're sewing at 5/8. So at 1/2 inch, you're going to run a stitch. This is called a stay stitch. I'm going to go over this when we talk about bias stitching, but basically this stay stitch is going to help stabilize your fabric so that when you put your collar in, your fabric doesn't stretch. So very slowly, no back tacking, just about 1 inch away from your band here, just to start and run a stitch at 1/2 inch all the way around to the other side. And then, so now I'm going to take my collar, I'm going to line up the center back with that notch that I made. I'm going to take the end of the collar and line it up with the end of the shirt. And again, my habit is to let the, in this case, the collar just go like a tiny, tiny, tiny bit further than the band, than the collar, than the shirt band, the front band, because I just like that little bit of, it really helps to line it up at the end. So I've got the center back pinned, I've got the side, I'm sorry, I've got the center back pinned, I've got the center front pinned. Now I'm going to line up that notch, so I have my notch in my fabric here and the notch in the shirt body. Put another pin in here, and then I'm going to ease in the rest of this. Again, you should feel like a kind of a natural, very, very subtle curve. Okay, and I want to make sure that you, when you pin, that you pin pretty well, because this is, you're going to have to make sure that, see where you have on the shirt side, on the shirt body side, you will get these little, because again, you're going around a curve, you have to remember. And I do want to stitch on this side of the shirt. So I want to make sure that the body is nice and flat. So going to pin it, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to take this all the way around to the other side of the shirt, do the same thing, and then I'm going to stitch at 5/8 all the way down, back tack here, stitch along the back neck, back tack at here at center front. Okay, so now I've stitched again that interfacing side of the collar stand to the neckline. Now I'm going to check it on the body side, make sure I have no catches, because again, you're going around a curve. So when you're in the machine, what you want to do is this, is to make sure as you go slowly that you open up the seam as you sew. Take the time to stop and make sure that that arch is open and that you're kind of moving the fullness over here. So don't just sew like straight. Take it a little piece at a time. As you're in the machine, double check underneath here and open it up. That's my advice. And that way you'll end up with no catches and it'll be nice and neat. Okay? Time to trim. So again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to score back the interfacing, and then at the corners, I think I'll get my other scissors. It's good to have some options with scissors because they act differently. So at the corner here, let me zoom in. Turn this upside down so you can see. So here's my corner, and again, this is all going to come underneath, and this is going to fold over. So let's get rid of this extra fabric in the corner here. And then obviously, don't go too close. I went a little close that time. Don't go too close, because this is going to have to come in and go over it. Okay, so take off your corner on both sides. Let me see, I'll go do this one a little better. Not too close. Came a little too close on that one. Take the corner off, and then go ahead, score back your interfacing right to the stitching. And then once you've done that, you're going to fold up, trim back your seam allowance. So scoring the interfacing almost to the stitching line, taking the seam allowance and cutting it in half. And then you're going to push it up just like the waistband once again underneath. This is going to fold under so neatly because you've taken the time to press it. And then I'm going to go ahead in and stitch it closed. So let me get that far and I'll come back. Once I've got my interfacing scored back to my stitching line and my seam allowance trimmed, I'm now going to go in and I'm going to clip. So I'm going to clip, use these scissors, every inch maybe. Again, I'm releasing the curve. I'm clipping almost to the seam line. Not quite, just enough to release the pressure of that curve. Again, depends on your fabric. My fabric is very loosely woven and making a mess everywhere. Okay, so you want to score, trim, and clip. Industry terms you should know. Then the next step is to take my seam allowance of the body and the top band and push it up, and then take my seam allowance that I pressed under from my underband, turn it over, and now I'm going to hand stitch just like you did with the waistband. So that should fall into place beautifully for you, so you don't have to fuss with it. Again, at the corner, you fold it in and let it come over. Make sure it catches that. That's why you want to make sure you don't clip too closely. So same thing here. Sometimes that causes a little pile there. I might score that back a little bit more. But that's going to go over the corner. And I'm going to start my hand stitching, just like I did with the cuff, from here all the way around to the front. So again, once I have it all pinned, I'm going to go in and I'm going to hand stitch it. At the beginning here, you can attach it right to the band. Small stitches, don't go big here. And then when you get here, you can pick up the stitches in the seam that you made, okay? Once I have this all hand stitched, I'm going to give it a really good press, and then I'm going to let you decide what you want to do about stitching. You can stitch along the, you can go all the way around. You can just stitch maybe the top and leave this. Kind of want to, I would think you would want to mock the cuff, so whatever you did on your cuff. So I did nothing at the top of my cuff. So I might leave this seam alone and just maybe do an edge stitch that follows along with the band here. Just do an edge stitch. But once I have the hand stitching done here, my function is completed, and now I get to think about my decorative. A really good press, put it on the dress form, and you've got yourself a shirt. And I'm excited for you. And next week, I'm going to talk about bands, stands, not bands, but stands, collar stands, so that you have an idea when you go into your drafting going forward and you're draping, mostly drafting, what a stand is. Because sometimes they're actually, you can do a collar with the stand built in so that the collar kind of takes this arc up over shape. It's really kind of an inexpensive application, so it usually indicates that there's a cost-saving method. So if you see garments like in Forever 21 and any kind of fast fashion, you'll see that where the collar stand is built into the collar. This is all one piece. So having a stand really shows that you know what you're doing. You're a good designer. And we'll talk about rolls and collars in general next week. And I'm also going to teach you about buttons and sizing and placing and direction and how to sew a button on. And that'll be next week's lesson. So congratulations once you get your collar on. Put it on the dress form, give it a good press, and stand back and just celebrate yourself, because this is great. I mean, putting together a shirt in your second semester of learning how to sew is quite an accomplishment, and I've been very, very pleased and excited with the work I've seen. So I can't wait to see it with the collar on and just about done. Okay? So good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.